Good evening. This is Goldie. It's Wednesday, August 25th, 2010, and I apologize, but I have some kind of cough that will probably be distracting for you. I'm still working on a website where I will post links to the articles I refer to and where the rants will reside. Remember, most importantly, I rant so you don't have to. However, that does not relieve you of your responsibility to think. Today is the famous summary number 1 day. I'm going to summarize most of the important topics that I've discussed since I started this rant in May 2010. Let me give you some history first. Throughout my life, I've always been the questioning type. In my teens, I was sure I knew it all, or was going to know it all. I read the New York Times. I was brought up Democrat, anti-Republican, anti-Nixon, pro-Jimmy Carter, anti-Reagan. As people age, they become codependent or independent, or some mixture of both. They struggle to put food on the table. I've been lucky. I can't say I've struggled to do that. It's been hard, yes, but struggled? I don't think so. I feel it's my duty to do something. And where that requirement of duty comes from, I actually don't know. However, I'm a problem solver, like the famous TV diagnostic Dr. House. There's a puzzle and there's a solution, or more than one. The puzzles I've chosen are large. How do we make this a better country? How do we make this a better world? It seems that I have a duty to attack it. And as I attack it, I understand that there is no purity of thought. We're all prejudiced by our past, our upbringing, our teachers, our friends, our TV, our music and art, and our media. So I don't pretend to say that I'm some kind of purist. There is no such thing. I am racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, elitist, egotistical, selfish, a liar, and a cheat. To some extent, we all are. From that basis, I have had in my past, opportunities for completely free thought, channeled by one or two great teachers. In those conversations, you would let the mind race as freely as possible. And when you ran into a brick wall, you figured out a different way to get around it or think about the problem. I wish I could do that on the show, but it's probably impossible. These conversations must occur outside of these weekly broadcasts. But these conversations, let's call them free-range rants, which I will define as requiring more than one person, can bring tears to your eyes as to the ideas that they create and polish. All right, so I used to be a ranter at every opportunity. I was a Democrat, and Republicans were fair game. They helped my arguments when they tried to justify things. As time went on, I realized that it was all just more bullshit, and that our futures were generally out of our hands. And this is the prevailing attitude in America today. It's out of my hands. This is another statement that just becomes a message. I'm not going to, or I don't think I have time to care. I understand that message. I've been in it, immersed, behind the wall, as Pink Floyd said, comfortably numb. I can tell you this, though, that when just one person comes up to me after a rant and tells me that they thought about some of the things that were said or defined or questioned in the rant, and then tells me that they see that some small or fundamental change maybe can be affected, they convey their hope to me, and that is my definition of success. Let's get back to the task at hand. I'm going to summarize and reiterate the really important themes and subjects that I've done since the first rants. Although before I do it, I suggest two things. One, that you see Mike Huckabee with John Voight on Fox on August 22nd, 2010. And two, that you watch the movie The Siege with Bruce Willis and Denzel Washington for an example of, in the first case, stupidity, idiocy, ignorance, and message, and two, for the slippery slope of racial profiling of Muslims at its absolute worst. I really need you to see The Siege. It was done in '98. I believe that the John Voight interview is the reason that I do these rants. The rage created while listening to this idiot talk about Obama's Marxist and socialist agenda aimed at bringing down this country in the Saul Alinsky model, and as a major theorem of the Tea Party, is quite informative. Huckabee is a presidential candidate, unannounced, and he did disagree with most of the major idiotic comments of Voight, while hitching his star to the Tea Party, and he did it as quite a balancing act. Huckabee is a master of moderation, but my God, Jon Voight. This is the reason why in Team America, the South Park boys made fun of the Film Actors Guild, or FAG as they put it in the movie. John, go back to acting and shut the F up. As with most teabaggers, he fails to see the connection between Obama and Bush. And if you just substituted Bush for Obama in his open letter that he read on the air, then you might have something to grasp, something of intelligence. But just an anti-Obama message and a focusing of the racist slant by opponents of the Tea Party shows Jon Voight either, one, his complete absolute lack of thinking on any of these matters, or two, a pure pro-Republican message. By doing 428 yoga breathing, I can sit back, relax, and realize that I'm very proud of what I'm doing here in these rants, which is the exact opposite of Jon Voight and Mike Huckabee. Okay, let's get going. In my first rants, I discussed the concept of the commons, as defined by Garrett Hardin in Tragedy of the Commons. The concept is fairly simple. The commons are items of common ownership that are resources. The first commons are air, land, and water. And Garrett Hardin uses the concept of a pasture, where cattle are run by all. In a time of underpopulation, everyone uses the commons. The grass regrows, and the cattle get fed. In a time of overpopulation of either the herders or total cattle, the resources are strained, the grass is decimated, and the commons is destroyed. It's a simple concept. It starts with the purely libertarian view of no government regulation in the case of abundant resources, and shows the need for government regulation as population increases and resources are strained. There cannot be a purely libertarian view of no regulation if there is any type of strain on resources. Some argue we have unlimited resources, or there is unlimited oil, or that nuclear fusion will cure all problems of energy. I don't believe it. So the concept of the tragedy of the commons is a concept of how do we manage both resources and population, or demand for those resources. Hardin's simple concept was of air, land, and water. As I've gone through these rants, I've argued that the concept of the commons is far broader than just air, land, and water. I've argued that tax dollars, public goods, which are tollways and other requested privatizations, the health of the nation, and the education of the nation are also, to a great extent, also commons. It turns out that our current system of regulating the commons is flawed, in that, using Garrett Hardin's example, one wealthy cattle herder gives money to the regulator and gets to use the pasture for just his cattle. Now that's not Garrett's argument, that's mine. The glaring example that I was able to use was the BP oil gusher. I did at least 4 specific rants on BP and commented on at least 3 more occasions about BP. BP was the greatest example ever. Everybody saw it on TV. Everybody heard what was being publicly spouted. Everybody heard Joe Barton apologize to BP executives. Everybody was sickened by what they saw. Everybody heard about them finally capping the gusher, and everybody forgot about the problem. It's the absolute classic example of America today. The America that watches American Idol. The America that struggles to put food on the table. The America that does not have the time or the energy to think about the underlying problems of the BP oil gusher and how it is related to most of the big problems that must be tackled. So I used it as an example of a tragedy of the commons being oil leases, regulations, and the use of the Gulf of Mexico as a garbage dump. BP showed us so many things that are wrong with the system. And in fact, I wished publicly, and still wish, that the gusher had continued through the 2010 election and inauguration of the new legislators. In thinking about the problem, I had no idea where my thinking would go. And I was rewarded, and I hope you feel rewarded, with a substantial and critical rant theory, that there is a fundamental, structural, regulatory defect in how our commons are administered by our elected and appointed regulatory officials. At this point, most Americans give up. They feel that they cannot do anything. Well, let me tell you where we got to in those rants, and my thinking and your subsequent comments. Some people blamed too much regulation. Some people blamed not enough regulation. Some people blamed the blowout preventer, and others just blamed BP. Some called BP evil. In fact, a lot of people did. And a lot of these people called for a boycott of BP. You heard what I said about boycotts. I hearken back to my law school days in contracts, a fresh law course. To breach a contract is not evil. It just carries a cost of some type of damages. And in this case, BP breached their lease and pollution regulations for which there are set penalties. Pro-business people always howl that regulations cost money, profits, and jobs. And they're actually correct. However, I argued that it is not BP's job to be good. It is their job to make the most money possible. Excuse me. It is their job to make the most money possible under the laws, regulations, and leases that apply to their drilling. I then argued that it was our fault, the voting public and taxpayers' fault, for the type of regulating that we do. It was here that I worked my way to my current theory of the fundamental structural regulatory defect. The regulated writes the regulations, and this happens in all regulated industries in America. The reason that the regulated write the regulations is because of several things that must be fixed in a constitutional amendment so that they cannot be overturned by friendly courts or new majorities in Congress. Number one, term limits for senators and representatives so that entrenched politicians are tossed out. They're all incompetent anyway, at least we all say, so why not have incompetent newbies up there? Number two, no revolving door for regulators into industry on a wink-wink, nod-nod basis when they leave government service. In this way, they are not beholden to the people that they regulate to give them a job when they leave government. Number three, only individuals can donate to political campaigns and drastically limit the amount of the donations. And most importantly, number four, we must amend the Constitution to say that Exxon and unions are not defined as a person entitled to free speech rights, which allows them to give unlimited sums to political campaigns, as set forth in the Citizens United Supreme Court case. MoveOn.org is actually pushing this amendment idea. In subsequent rants, I argued that the drug war, economic collapse, financial BS re-regulation with exemptions for auto dealers, coal industry regulation, nuclear regulation, and privatizations all are flawed by the exact same thing. Now, I considered this a breakthrough, and it's not a partisan Democrat or Republican problem. It's a problem with the system of how we regulate, and it can only be cured by changing the system. And I suggested that only a constitutional amendment will permanently fix this problem. If you want clean air, clean water, clean land, and the true cost to society of the cost to the commons included in the cost of oil, drugs, coal, financial instruments, and privatizations, then this defect must be fixed. What I'm talking about is that we don't usually pay the actual real cost, including cleanups, in the price of oil or gas or coal or financial instruments or drugs, legal drugs. Now, if you don't want to fix this, just leave it as it is. But do not, I repeat, do not say that this problem is because either Democrats or Republicans are in office. It does not matter who's up there. Specifically, I'm including any newly elected teabaggers. And I use that as a message word, not as an insult. So we at least have an answer throughout these rants. It's maybe not something that can be done, but at least we know what we have to do to fix the problem. Early on, I talked about the drug war and how easy it would be to stop all of the border killings and Mexican cartel killings. In fact, what would those cartels do if all the drugs were legalized? I compared drug legalization to prohibition by using the example of how many shootings there are at the H-E-B's in Austin between rival beer suppliers. Think about the number 0. I talked about how the drug companies want me on Oxy, Paxil, Zoloft, and Vicodin. I talked about how this is the same BP structural defect, just substituting the drug war for offshore drilling regulation. Remember, these drug companies tell with their Citizens United campaign funding. They tell the senators and representatives in Washington to keep funding the drug war. I talked about how the industry-written policy that allows so many Americans to become cheaply addicted to these dangerous drugs. Think, the drug companies will lose billions if weed is legalized. It seems so simple. I harped on privacy for many rants. I defined what a slippery slope was as a slow erosion of a fundamental right and the need for vigilance to stop the slide down the slope. I talked about proposed surveillance cameras, and I talked about our declining expectation of privacy. Yesterday, I heard on the radio, Williamson County announced a social networking policy for its county employees that does not allow them to harm the reputation of the county. Think about it. How would they know about anything you posted if you didn't friend them? In any event, as to the surveillance cameras, I talked about the irreparable harm of your daughter's nude videos made by these intrusive cameras showing up on YouTube. Permanent irreparable harm. I talked about how we all agree that governments are incompetent. I showed evidence of such incompetence and an inability of even private industry to secure data. I showed evidence of no crime prevention outcome from such cameras. At the end of the day, I reached the conclusion that it was impossible for them to safeguard the data adequately. And since the only justification was an enhanced feeling of safety where there are cameras, which enhanced feeling of safety made you actually less secure, and that therefore there should not be surveillance cameras. I also talked about how the same structural defect that led to the BP gusher is at work with vendors of the cameras, pushing the technology to our governments, and the decimation of our commons. Commons in this case being our taxpayer money, being paid out by police purchasing agents to buy these cameras. So in the end, think, we taxpayers are paying money to camera vendors to sell us overpriced technology to police purchasing agents who are then getting jobs in these industries after they get out of the police force. And in the process, we're losing our privacy for no good reason. Seriously, Cindy, what's your argument? Excuse me. It's water. As to immigration, I went through the messages, the Arizona law, the anchor baby arguments, and I tied them to our declining standard of living, which has been going on for quite some time. I used Garrett Hardin's analysis of limited resources and came to the conclusion that we do need to get our arms around the problem of securing the borders and dealing with the 12 million or so people that are here illegally. Excuse me. I went through an analysis of what racial profiling is, and I came to the conclusion that we do not want it here. Again, watch the 1998 movie The Siege for further clarification of the feel of racial profiling. I tore apart surveys that said most Americans like the Arizona law and feel that the anti-racial profiling provisions in it are sufficient. I stated that whites had no capital R right to say that racial profiling will not occur, since they cannot experience it. I got an email, and I'm ignoring that some white people have been pulled over in the 4th Ward in Houston, which, by the way, would prove my point, since those white people, I would assume, would definitely be against racial profiling. In these immigration rants, I'm trying to help you cut through the messages you hear to get to the meat of the argument or the change that's required. I concluded after all of this, we must secure the borders and simultaneously create some type of path to citizenship for the ones that are here already. I stated that we need to get our arms around the total number of people that will be using services in this country, since we're running out of money and we'll be getting even less in the future from our government. But we cannot use racial profiling to do it. It is too fundamental of a right. This is America, and it's not Sean Hannity's America, but our America. The anchor baby argument just seems like a red herring for the 2010 elections if it's not tied to complete immigration reform and securing the borders simultaneously. However, I did say that if a constitutional convention got called because of the anchor baby argument, then maybe it's worth it, so that we can put forth my proposed amendments to fix the structural regulatory defect that led to BP. So we've solved the immigration problem. We just need to do it. As to health care, I tore apart the surveys that said that most Americans wanted Obamacare repealed, without them reading the bill, of course. I stated that people who had a pre-existing condition or who had been denied coverage under their existing plans or were denied new coverage liked the law in the promise that they would get health care. I stated that people that had never been denied coverage or who did not have a pre-existing condition did not want anything changed. They, of course, have never read their policies. I stated that the argument that Obamacare would lead to rationing was bogus, as health care is already rationed. I did not conclude that Obamacare was better than the existing system, but I opined that the idea of a company denying coverage to make profits seemed wrong somehow, and that health care was not like the sale of inkjet cartridges. At least it smelled that way. I thought that the Obamacare change to the ability of a company to deny coverage would lead to substantial changes in the system, and that there will end up being two tiers of coverage. One for the rich for cash who will get up-to-date chemo, and one for the rest of us who will have to use 5-year-old chemo. That's just my example, an exaggerated example, but an example. I did not conclude that Obamacare would be better. I did, however, hypothesize on what types of incentives we could give people to make them healthier and use less services. I stated that personal responsibility as a concept requires you to give up smoking cigarettes and work out more, since there will be less coverage for you later, no matter what happens to Obamacare. I talked about the anti-Obamacare complaint of the mandate to participate or be penalized. I had received emails from friends who said that they did not want to participate in the healthcare system and didn't want to be forced to pay. My retort was the example of an uninsured or non-participating person having their leg cut off in front of an emergency room. You're going to get treatment no matter what, so shouldn't you participate to pay for that risk? I think in discussions with people, we've reached a consensus that everyone is willing to pay for everyone to have an H1N1 flu shot if they want it. Isn't that the start of universal health care? And from there, isn't it just matters of degree that people get health care? There seems to be a national interest in stopping an epidemic. So it's kind of a commons, if you will, the health of the nation when people come to the workplace sick. We don't want that. Excuse me. Continuing on with the concept of personal responsibility, I did state that people need to understand that if they have children, it's a choice. And don't come whining to me later that you don't have enough money to send your kids to college. I stated that I, as a taxpayer, was willing to pay for 2 of your kids to go to public school. This was a theory, but no more than 2. And certainly, I'm not willing to pay for the octuplet mom. I did not, however, come up with a cure for our failing public school system. I did say that you should probably not go to college if you're not going to go to graduate school, as your debt will be unpayable on a college education only. I supported the Chicago Second Amendment gun rights decision by the Supreme Court, as I felt the concept of protecting certain fundamental rights is too important to argue against the right of gun ownership, with limited restrictions in licensing. It is the Second Amendment to the Constitution after all. How are you going to argue for First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment rights without supporting the Second Amendment? The ACLU has problems with this, at least in the Northeast. I talked about the mosque not at ground zero, and I talked about the importance of the First Amendment. I think I talked down to a lot of people who were, and still are, offended by the mosque on sacred ground, as they put it. Guess what? Your being offended is so much lower on the totem pole than the right of any religion to build a church where it's properly zoned. In fact, it's not even on the totem pole. It's under the totem pole. I don't care whether you're offended or not. Now, there's other people to those who say that these people do not have the right to build the mosque there, I say you are stupid, bigoted, intolerant idiots. And those are the ones that say that they don't have the right to build it there. And that's painful. This is different than those who are saying it's in bad taste or offensive to build a mosque there. I said, why does this specific religion have to worry about giving offense when a Christian church being built here would be met by crickets? That's what the First Amendment's about. The hard cases. I talked a bit about eminent domain and the Supreme Court case of Kelo versus New London. I talked about how uncertainty as to an eminent domain power being used for purely economic purposes causes more uncertainty and a lack of development. And I compared it to East 12th Street in Austin, where there's an eminent domain power due to an urban renewal plan, and there's no development there. I agreed with Republicans that regulation and uncertainty in regulation, which is what a threat of eminent domain is, causes heartburn. It's not good for maximizing profits, which is what all individuals and corporations must do for our system to continue. And that sure does not sound like a socialist or Marxist message. I also compared this uncertainty to the uncertainty of regulation in Costa Rica, where the threat of bribes and the mordida is alive and well. I talked about how MoveOn.org is a Democratic Party mouthpiece, much as Fox is a Republican Party mouthpiece. I harped on Fox a lot, but that's only because they're so much more consistent with their messaging than the Democrats, MSNBC. And I love those guys at Fox. I talked about message words like Obamacare, socialist, Marxist, cap and tax, conservative, progressive, secular progressives, and how such words have absolutely no meaning except the message. I will continue to talk about these messages and their relationship to the actual problems we face and the possible solutions that we can come up with. I've tried to give you ammunition so that you're not frustrated by partisan arguments that fail to reach any agreement at all. I've been able to successfully convince my Republican brethren that I'm not a Democrat, but a problem solver. I just don't have the time left in my life to argue stupid crap. I ask you all to keep surprising me with intelligent comments and questions. I hope that this brief summary is going to allow me to keep moving forward as new info comes in on each of these points, as well as the numerous points that I have not yet touched upon, like abortion, taxation, the FDA, and food definitions of organic, water usage, torture, and historic zoning. I can't help it. And here's a hang on. Those were the future points we're going to be talking about. Now, I can't help it today. Here's a preview of my opinion on historic districts and zoning. In today's Statesman on page 1, there's an article entitled, "Will Axing Tax Break Imperil Preservation?" And by preservation, they mean old houses and structures that get tax breaks for being old. I can only say that I pray that by axing the tax breaks, the structures get the axe as well. Your comments would be greatly appreciated. On Ustream, I have titled each of the rants by the main topic, so I would suggest going back for clarification. This will allow us all to move on and actually get something done. That's all there is today, and I want to thank you all for watching, listening, and thinking. I also want to thank our sponsors, pianobyangelo.com, Angelo Limbesis, who teaches and plays keyboards all over Austin. ZetaDesign.com for all of your decorative painting needs. She can make anything look like anything. AustinAreaPlumbing.com for all of your plumbing problems and redos. TicoAdventureLodge.com, TicoAdventureLodge.com, a small hotel in Samara, Costa Rica. CNC Surf School in Samara, that's CNC Surf Samara, SAMARA.webs.com. La Vela Latina, a great sunset restaurant in Samara, Costa Rica. Amhar Tequila at www.santospirits.com, an extremely smooth tequila. Also, if you're in Dallas, go see Anna Proctor play at the Bryan Street Tavern in Dallas this Friday at 9. She is way too smooth. Thanks, and God bless.